Mary Lynne and Luke today for the nuptial mass. We read about in the gospel about man leaving home, leaving father and mother and holding on to his wife. And that's what we are here to celebrate today. And it's not just that we find that in the gospel text today, but really we find that idea embodied and embraced also with today's saint providentially. Today's saint is the Saint Paul the Hermit, and it's not that either one of you should ever enter into just solitude, a hermitage. That's not really the idea of matrimony now, is it? But there's actually a lot of parallels with his story and where you find yourselves right at this moment in time and how to take that and continue on forward with your life beginning today together. St. Paul the Hermit, he was a young man in Egypt, and all of a sudden he found himself in a time not too dissimilar to ours as it is. He found himself facing down persecution, a government that was overflowing from its power and desirous of stamping out those who wanted to stand in the way, in this case, the Christians. And by that, Paul, the young man, was forced to flee. His own sister's husband reported him to the government, ratted him out for his faith. His sister protested, begged, pleaded, but who wouldn't have anything to do with it. No, he was a faithful servant of the emperor, and so he must report. And off Paul went to save his life, fleeing from the town he had known from his birth and arriving out in the middle of the desert, not knowing what he would do at that point. The desert, there he found, would be one that would be a source of providence of God for him. After all, did he not flee because he had been faithful? And in maintaining that faith, he arrived there only to find that all of his needs were met. He looked for shelter, and as he searched, he found the perfect spot. There was a cave up in the hills, there in a bit of solitude, away from any prying eyes. And in fact, this cave had a door that would be able to be rolled shut, so that at night time, when he had his fire and things like that, nobody could see into the cave if he didn't want them to. He also found there that despite shutting it up with the rock, he would always have access to fresh air and a nice cool breeze, because at the back of the cave it was open up to the sky. Yet from the heat of the day and the occasional rain that sometimes frequents in the desert, and when it comes very hard, it was protected by palm trees which grew over the back hole to keep all type of rain and harsh sunlight out of there. He found inside the cave a spring of fresh, clean water that rose up from the ground and bubbled forth, that he had an unlimited supply to be able to drink from. He found the tools and things necessary to be able to sustain his life, for building what he needed, for fashioning the things to be able to keep himself occupied and industrious throughout the day, scattered throughout areas of his own cave and those nearby, as there had been many that had been abandoned as work sites. And so he found work for himself there alone. And lastly, he found food for himself. Food provided by his only companion, the animals, who came and visited him and were as tame as pets to him in that cave. Every day he had a raven who flew to him and brought him half a loaf of bread, all that he needed to be sustained. And with this, he lived very happily. He found that the necessity of his flight into the desert, the need to leave behind his family and his friends and everything that he had known, had actually been transformed for him into a great joy. And there, ultimately, he found his vocation from God. He found that he was to be that hermit who lived his life in prayer and sacrifice and service of God, focused on that alone, focused on obtaining eternity. And so, even after the persecution ended, Paul, he never left the desert again. At one point in time, another man, a holy man of the desert, St. Anthony, heard of this great hermit, St. Paul, and he wanted to go and to visit him. Anthony was old at that time. He was 90, but he knew Paul had been even older. Paul was 113 at that point. And so Anthony set out across the desert on a long journey, carrying with him only the walking stick and faith that God would provide in everything. He followed the directions that he had heard from others who had witnessed St. Paul escaping back out into this cave, and the hearsay about where he might exist. And he traveled all the way to get there. As he drew near, he saw wolves coming as tame as dogs, walking up to this cave, hidden up on the top, and going gently inside. Other animals came in and out of the cave as well. And so Anthony figured that must be where St. Paul was. And he began to approach and saw, in fact, there was a dim light shining out from the cave. As he got nearer to the cave, though, all of a sudden he stubbed his toe and let out a loud cry. At doing so, Paul heard this and closed the door. And there was no entrance given to the cave. Hours St. Anthony spent on his knees praying that the door might be opened again. And he begged and pleaded with the man inside, telling him, "Please, you have given shelter and entrance to beasts, but you will not do so for a man. What type of man comes to beg, but if only to steal from you afterwards? I mean no harm, I just mean to meet you." Finally, Paul opens the door to the cave and wearily lets his new visitor in. Soon afterwards, it is shown to him that it is providence that his solitude be interrupted by this kindly visit, this newfound friend, and Anthony, his fellow hermit. They sit and they begin to talk about the things of God. They realize that they, too, both are holy men serving the same master. And as they sit and talk a little while, in comes the raven, flying in with the daily food. Yet instead of the half a loaf, he carries a full loaf in his claws. For the first time in 60 years of solitude in the desert, the raven came with a double serving of bread, sufficient for the both of them. God provided to his faithful, no matter what the situation would be. Both of you sort of find yourselves in that same type of spot. You have moved away from where you are from for a greater purpose. Mary Lynne, you've moved from a home not terribly far away, but far enough in order that you might have more ready access to the sacraments, that you might not have as many constraints by a state here as opposed to that in Illinois, or that you may find for yourself as well those good Catholic friends, many of whom are here today, to join you. That a Catholic life, a full parochial life, awaited you if you moved and took that little bit of step of faith. Luke, you came onto the other side of the earth. And it was very much because, really, a state of persecution One cannot look at Australia, your home, and not think to themselves, it has returned to the prison that it once was before. Yet, you knew that sacraments were of great importance to your soul. Where could you get them? There was no guarantee that anybody might come to you in the near future where you lived. So you must go to them. And so you kind of bamboozle the system of Australia, find yourself on the plane ride over here, get into the country to come to our YAG and to be and make Catholic friends and to receive the sacraments and to be able to have a respite from that incarceration. And you realize that here truly is where your faith can flourish, and that perhaps that flight away from persecution could turn into a sweetness, a desire that you didn't want to let go. And so the stay extended indefinitely until you realized that it wasn't merely a stay, but a realization of your vocation. Your vocation to marriage to your new, soon-to-be wife, Mary Lynne, and a calling to which everything, despite all of the odds, God has provided for all along the way. He's seen to it that whatever obstacles and whatever necessities were to be obtained for you to reach this day, that they were realized, and that they were put into place, and that your half a loaf was gained for yourselves. And yet, here you are, day one of letting somebody into your own cave. And if you stay faithful, and are faithful together, prayerful, always remembering that you are two people serving the same master, a master whom you will be joined together with intimately in the sacrament of matrimony here in a few moments, and that you work together toward that end of sanctification and of salvation always. You'll realize that in joining together and embarking on that new vocation, God will not fail to provide for whatever you need moving forward as well. The raven, he can carry 2 halves of bread. It's not a problem. There's enough for both of you in divine providence, in the good care of the good God to go around, that your lives moving forward can flourish and be a great source of grace and holiness and love for each other and for God. And so remember that each and every day, when it's time for you to pray, when it's time that you are in need of lifting each other up, when things are not always the easiest, when sometimes you look down and you wonder, how are we going to make it through? You've gotten here because God has called you. And he would not call you to a dead end. No, he may try, he may test, but he will always provide if you maintain that same faithfulness and confidence and prayerfulness and trust in him. May God bless you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.